Promoted to Foreign Secretary by Theresa May, Mr Johnson's performance in the role further increased scepticism among some Tory MPs. In November 2017, Boris Johnson faced criticism for suggesting the jailed charity worker Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was training journalists.
When you look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing, it's just, she was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it, at the very limit.
Boris Johnson later apologised for his remarks. There has been a catalogue of gaffes, but many Tory activists adore his charismatic showmanship. No other Tory contender has such name recognition. If Conservative MPs vote him through to the final two, he would be hard to beat in a ballot of members. But getting through to the runoff will be his big challenge, with some Tory MPs determined to stop a man they think is frivolous, divisive and unfit for the highest office. If he becomes Prime Minister, the figurehead of Brexit will have to decide what happens next. Today, Mr Johnson said he would seek to renegotiate an agreement the EU insists is closed, but insisted the UK would leave on October the 31st, with or without a deal.
The Conservative membership is traditionally regarded as being dominated by older people. For many new, younger members, this will be their first chance to choose the party leader. Our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, has been to meet some at Reading University.
Winning round younger voters hasn't always been easy for the Tories. At Reading University, the party has the support of the Student Conservative Association. Theresa May is their patron. Many have campaigned alongside her. As they gathered outside the Students' Union today, there were conflicting views about her decision.
I think she's tried her best for the country, and it's always sad to see someone forced out of office.
Anyone pleased to see her go?
Yes. For me, she should have gone after the election.
These young Tory members will vote in the leadership contest, and views on Mrs May's successor are divided.
We need a new leader, a new direction, hopefully someone who can get the Brexit business finished once and for all so we can move on.
For me, it has to be a Brexiteer because we've got to fight the Brexit Party.
The Brexit Party could potentially do very well at the expense of the Conservative Party, and you do need someone to kind of bring back the Brexit vote.
Most believe the party needs to change if it's going to win support beyond traditional Tory voters.
There has to be a real change of direction for the rest of young people to really come on board.
We need someone that can come in and sell Conservative ideology and that is charismatic and outgoing. Theresa May hasn't been that. So for me, someone like Boris would be able to do that.
I just think he's a bit of a clown. I think a lot of young people think that too.
There is recognition that overcoming the Europe question won't be easy for any future leader.
I don't think it's possible, really. I think it's going to carry on until we leave.
While Brexit is really important, I think you then also need to look at the wider politics as a whole and actually have a plan for the future, not just right now.
While there is optimism among the members of Reading University's Conservative Association, they have no doubt as to the scale of the challenge the party is facing if it's to remain relevant for future generations.
The European Commission has stressed that Theresa May's decision to resign has not altered its stance on the withdrawal agreement negotiated with her government. EU leaders have praised Mrs May's determination. Some have expressed fear that the UK could now be heading for a disorderly departure. Our Europe editor Katja Adler is following developments from Brussels.
As soon as the Prime Minister finished her speech, expressions of respect, though notably not regret, started coming in from leaders across Europe. Here in Brussels, the spokeswoman of Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the European Commission, made clear that finishing the Brexit process was the EU's primary concern.
As he has said before, Theresa May is a woman of courage for whom he has great respect. He will equally respect and establish working relations with any new Prime Minister, whomever they may be.
Those four words, whoever they may be, allude to the EU fear that Boris Johnson or another arch-Brexiteer is most likely to become Mrs May's successor. The EU has game-planned the prospect of Prime Minister Boris for months now. The worry here is that Mr Johnson or another Brexiteer, keen to prove their spurs, will want to play to the gallery at home, obstructing EU business where they can, as long as the UK remains a reluctant member. EU leaders assume the new Prime Minister will ask for another Brexit extension, allowing more time to hold a general election or to try to renegotiate the current divorce deal, particularly the controversial backstop guarantee for the Irish border. Brussels insists it will not budge, but Dublin worries that EU resolve could come under pressure if faced with the real prospect of a no-deal Brexit. This was the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar today.
We now enter a new phase when it comes to Brexit, and a phase that may be a very dangerous one for Ireland. In the next couple of months we may see the election of a Eurosceptic Prime Minister who wants to repudiate the withdrawal agreement and go for no deal, or we may even see a new British government that wants a closer relationship with the EU and goes for a second referendum. But whatever happens, we're going to hold our nerve.
A number of EU countries, notably France, think it probably best to close the door sooner rather than later on a country that's leaving anyway. With that in mind, President Macron said the UK must now urgently clarify its position on Brexit. He worries a hardline Brexiteer Prime Minister could help fuel the Eurosceptic debate in political parties across Europe. Germany, on the other hand, would prefer to give the UK more time, if not to change its mind about Brexit, then at least to avoid a chaotic and costly no-deal scenario.
When the new Prime Minister enters Downing Street in late July, he or she will face the harsh reality of trying to break the political deadlock over Brexit. With Britain due to leave the EU at the end of October, the problems that beset Mrs May are still very much there. Our political correspondent Ian Watson considers the task ahead.
With Theresa May's departure, no deal and arguably no Brexit have become more likely. Any new leader will have to promise their Brexit-supporting membership that leaving the EU without a deal is back on the table. But there are only limited options for solving the Brexit puzzle with no parliamentary majority. If the next Prime Minister decided simply to leave with no deal in October, MPs could, as they did before, try to seize control of the parliamentary process to prevent this. So it's more likely that Mrs May's successor will at least attempt a renegotiation. But the EU would have to agree to remove the Northern Irish backstop to gain the backing of the DUP and most Conservative MPs. They despise the measure to avoid a hard border in Ireland, as they believe it would keep the UK too close to EU rules. But the Irish Deputy Prime Minister Simon Coveney indicated today that it won't be renegotiated. The alternative approach, tried to win over more Labour support by promising to put any deal to a referendum, could bring a fledgling premiership to a premature end. So if the next Prime Minister has no viable offer to put to Parliament by October, he or she may take the view that it's time to change its composition. Providing there's been a bounce in the polls, Mrs May's successor could risk an election, or opponents of no deal could call a vote of confidence, forcing an election anyway. Changing the Prime Minister doesn't alter the underlying problems. Breaking the Brexit deadlock may now require radicalism rather than mere resilience.
In her resignation statement, Theresa May recalled advice from the late Sir Nicholas Winton, who saved hundreds of Jewish children from Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia by organising the Kindertransport that brought them to Britain. Sir Nicholas had been a constituent of hers in Maidenhead for many years.
At another time of political controversy, a few years before his death, he took me to one side at a local event and gave me a piece of advice. He said, "Never forget that compromise is not a dirty word. Life depends on compromise." He was right.
Our reality check correspondent Chris Morris examines Mrs May's own record on pursuing compromise.
When Theresa May first became Prime Minister after campaigning for Remain in the referendum, there was little sense that she was seeking a middle ground on Brexit. In her first party conference speech in October 2016, she promised to end the free movement of people from the EU, end the role of the European Court of Justice in the UK, and take the country out of the single market and the customs union, all while maintaining completely free trade with the EU in both goods and services. For her critics, this was an undeliverable have-your-cake-and-eat-it Brexit. And while her red lines have become familiar, at the time they were greeted with astonishment in other EU capitals. They also alienated Remain-supporting MPs who could see little room for compromise. In March 2017, she triggered Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, starting the clock on 2 years of Brexit talks, before any consensus had been found in Parliament or elsewhere about what the UK really wanted. Only after many months of difficult negotiations did the idea of compromise come to the fore, and the withdrawal agreement was the eventual result. But by then the political divisions surrounding Brexit had become entrenched. Partly as a result of the Prime Minister's own policy choices, she'd created expectations among Leave supporters which she could not fulfil. Her successor, whoever it may be, will be faced with similar choices. And looking ahead, it's hard to see where compromise may be found.
Throughout her premiership, Theresa May stressed her commitment to public service. And this was reflected in her first speech in Downing Street, where she outlined her ambition to tackle injustice and build a better Britain. But as our correspondent James Landale reports, her time in office was dominated by one issue.
Theresa May entered Downing Street in 2016 determined to deliver Brexit. In the end, her premiership was consumed by it. Her decision to pursue what was seen as a hard Brexit outside the single market and customs union divided Parliament and her party and ultimately sowed the seeds of her downfall. This was not the plan when the newly elected leader set out her priorities outside number 10.
We will make Britain a country that works not for a privileged few, but for every one of us.
Theresa May became Prime Minister because David Cameron resigned after the EU referendum and her opponents gave up during the brief leadership contest that followed. She was the safe pair of hands, the Home Secretary who had survived for 6 years in that most difficult of jobs, the former party chairman in 2002 who had challenged her party to change.
Our base is too narrow, and so occasionally are our sympathies. You know what some people call us? The nasty party.
Mrs May was also, in the words of Ken Clarke, the bloody difficult woman who would take no nonsense from Brussels, the Remainer who would ensure Britain left.
Brexit means Brexit, and we're going to make a success of it.
But the new Prime Minister made what many saw as mistakes, none bigger than in 2017, when she sought a greater mandate and majority.
It was with reluctance that I decided the country needs this election. But I say it is necessary to secure the strong and stable leadership the country needs, so that we have the strong and stable leadership we need. Who do you trust to actually have the strong and stable leadership?
And what we're saying is the Conservatives are the largest party. Note, they don't have an overall majority at this stage.
This proved a catastrophic error. She campaigned poorly, lost her majority, and was forced to seek the support of the Democratic Unionist Party MPs. But instead of accepting the new parliamentary arithmetic, she acted as if nothing had changed. What her supporters saw as dogged determination, her critics viewed as stubborn inflexibility, and opposition grew. Her party conference speech in 2017 seemed to capture the mood of decline.
10 years after Northern Rock, our economy is back on track.
Mrs May's refusal to be open about the trade-offs between sovereignty and access to EU markets infuriated negotiators in Brussels. Equally, her proposals, hammered out at Chequers last year, infuriated Brexiteer ministers, some of whom resigned. But eventually, after kicking the can down the road for years, she finally agreed a deal in November last year.
Cabinet members are being briefed tonight on a draft Brexit agreement reached.
The problem was that the compromise agreed to avoid border checks on the island of Ireland was rejected by the DUP and Brexiteer Tory MPs. So she failed to get her withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons. An attempt to cut a deal with Labour failed. Despite losing repeated votes, Mrs May clung on. Eventually, her authority drained away, she lost the confidence of her cabinet, and she had no choice but to go. Theresa May was a conscientious, hard-working Prime Minister imbued with a sense of public duty. But she was also seen as a dogmatic politician ill-suited to the task before her. One more Conservative leader brought down by Europe.
In the city, the 100 share index closed up 46 points at 7,278. In New York, a short time ago, the Dow Jones was up 72 at 25,562. On the currency markets, the pound was up 0.2 cents at $1.27. And against the euro, sterling was down 0.2 cents at €1.13, and that makes a euro worth 88 pence. 2 teenage boys have died after what police described as a serious incident in a house in Sheffield. 4 other children aged between 7 months and 11 are being treated in hospital. A man and a woman have been arrested on suspicion of murder. Reporting from Sheffield, our North of England correspondent, Danny Savage.
It was about 7:30 this morning when police and paramedics were called to a semi-detached house in the Shire Green area of the city. 6 children were taken to hospital, but at lunchtime, detectives said the 2 eldest, boys aged 13 and